Hi guys, Talisha from P3 here. Today we're going to be talking about the standing calf raise and how manipulating the foot positioning will allow for more targeted rehabilitation responses. When it comes to physical rehabilitation, we know that what we are doing will yield specific tissue adaptations, and what I'm talking about with the what, that's our dosage. So dosage refers to sets, reps, tempo, frequency, resistance, and so on. But we can create more nuance and a more targeted tissue response if we also manipulate the how. Now, in today's example, the how is performing the calf raise in either an abducted or adducted position. Given the function of the gastrocoileus muscle complex and its involvement in a large number of lower extremity musculoskeletal pathologies, it's no wonder the calf raise exercise poses such a large clinical utility for our functional restoration programs. Now, if we have more of an understanding of our what, which is our dosage, and also the how, which are further variables that we can manipulate, it can give this exercise even more bang for our buck when we're using it in clinical practice. Whilst there haven't been a huge amount of studies published on this area, there are quite a few that are relatively decent in their study quality. And there's two main things that they've published their findings on. The first is Emg Muscle Activation when performing the abducted or adducted calf raise. And then the second is the Hypertrophy Adaptations of the gastrocnemius. Now, in relation to Emg activity, there are two studies that have been published on this, one in 2017 and one in 2011. And what they found was that there were differences in Emg muscle activation of the medial and lateral heads of the gastrocnemius. And one of the studies in particular also looked at perineal and tibialis posterior muscle activation as well when performing the calf raise in either an abducted or adducted position. Now, in relation to specific Emg activation of different muscles in the lower extremity, what they found was people performing the calf raise in an adducted, that's the feet turned inwards, 30 degrees, it found that the lateral head of the gastrocnemius, the tibialis posterior, and the flexor digitorum longus all demonstrated higher rates of Emg activity. And then on the flip side, those muscles that had higher Emg activity when performing the abducted calf raise, that is performing the calf raise with the feet turned outward 30 degrees, it showed that the medial head of the gastrocnemius and the peroneus longus had higher rates of Emg firing. Now, if we look at the hypertrophy response, the paper that I'm referring to was published in 2020, and what they found were those that were performing the calf raise with the feet in a neutral position or facing straight ahead yielded similar adaptations in hypertrophy between the medial and the lateral head of the gastroc. However, those that were performing the calf raise with the feet in an adducted position, that is feet turned in 30 degrees, it demonstrated a higher hypertrophy response of the lateral head of the gastrocnemius. And then when people were performing the calf raise in an abducted position, that is feet turned outward 30 degrees, it had a higher hypertrophy response of the medial head of the gastrocnemius. So before we dig too far into how the different foot positioning may trigger these increases in adaptations, if we dial it back a little bit and just refresh ourselves on the normal tissue adaptations to different dosage exposures of certain exercises, this will help point us in the right direction and get us understanding how there are these nuances that we can create by altering foot positioning even further. So when I'm talking about the stock standard responses, this is alterations of, say, type 1 and type 3 collagen in relation to eccentric or concentric muscle contractions. So we know that eccentric contractions tend to increase the response of, say, tendon remodeling or even type 1 and type 3 collagen remodeling in muscular tissue. And this is because eccentric contractions tend to produce higher internal forces. So because there's higher internal forces being applied to the tissue, it creates a bigger tissue response. So that's why we see eccentric contractions generating higher levels of tissue remodeling. And that's why they're often pegged as the gold standard for a lot of musculoskeletal pathologies. So if we have that little bit of understanding kind of under our belt, then if we think about foot positioning, so what foot positioning would be doing is altering the lever arm. So if we're moving the foot in either an abducted or adducted position, what that's doing is it's creating a slightly longer lever arm on one side versus the other. So then if we've got this slightly longer lever arm, then it means that the head of the gastrocnemius that's doing the eccentric movement with that longer lever arm is going to be exposed to higher loads for a slightly prolonged period of time, or slightly longer period of time, compared to the head of the gastroc that's got that shorter lever arm. So that would be why we're seeing this increase in hypertrophy response to the medial versus lateral head of the gastroc. Now, as healthcare practitioners, if we're able to get a better understanding of how the body will respond to certain movements and their dosages, and have an understanding of how manipulating these variables will create specific tissue adaptations, it allows us to be a lot more targeted with our rehabilitation programming. So a great example of the clinical utility of manipulating, say, our dosage variables like tempo and also foot positioning of the standing calf raise can be in relation to a calf strain injury at the myotendinous junction at the medial head of the gastroc. Now, if we get our clinical critical thinking hats on, a really good example of the clinical utility of manipulating dosage variables in addition to foot positioning is in relation to, say, a strain injury of the medial head of the gastroc at the myotendinous junction. So as we know, this is the most common site for calf strain injuries to occur. And if we dial it back a little bit and just have a bit of a refresh of what strain injuries are, essentially it's an eccentric type muscle injury. So eccentric muscle contractions serve to decelerate the body and or to store elastic energy ready for a concentric movement. So that's our stretch shorten cycle coming into play. Now, when a strain injury occurs, essentially it's where there's been excessive active lengthening. So the muscle units are activated and they're trying to slow down the lengthening of the muscle. But what happens is if the force that's being applied to the muscle exceeds its ability to decelerate the movement, a strain injury will occur. So the therapeutic goal for someone that's suffered a strain injury, one is to restore the tissue integrity, but then we also want to improve the eccentric strength so these eccentric type injuries or the active lengthening injuries don't occur again. So what we need to do with this is, one, we'll be working on the tempo. So first up, we would probably go with a slower tempo, so we're not creating a very rapid tissue assault. But then we can also manipulate the foot positioning to alter this as well. So in the early stages of healing, we may not want a degree or a high degree of eccentric load in that area. So we may perform the calf raise in an adducted position, because as we know, the calf raise in an adducted position will cause increased hypertrophy responses of the lateral head of the gastroc, which means that there's higher eccentric load happening there. So again, we may perform it in an adducted position, so it's not putting as much strain on that medial head. And then as we progress, we may tinker around and then eventually move them into a neutral position. So when we're getting even eccentric loading of the medial and lateral heads. And then when we come to the end of the programming, or not right at the end, but the end of the sort of foot manipulation of the calf raise, we may move into an abducted position. Now with this, the abducted position will create an increased eccentric load of the medial head and a slightly lesser response on the lateral head. So that's how foot positioning may allow us to manipulate a little bit of the eccentric load going through the strain area. And then what we would do is we can also manipulate the tempo. So typically if we do a slower response, that will slower tempo, that will elicit, it's kind of a safer movement, because when we've had excessive active lengthening, that's where it's a rapid movement that's happened and the body hasn't been able to cope with that. So we may start off with a slower tempo and then gradually increase the speed in which the eccentric contraction is happening to hopefully progress up to a plyometric type movement where there's a really rapid eccentric contraction followed by a rapid concentric contraction. So whilst today we've discussed the specific hypertrophy and EMG activation of the calf muscle in relation to foot positioning, we can actually use foot positioning for a few other musculoskeletal pathologies. Now with this, we just have to think of mechanisms of injury and or certain positions that will aggravate the certain areas or certain tissues. So for example, let's say we're talking about an ankle sprain injury where we've had a tissue injury, a grade 1 or 2 sprain to the ATFL. So that typically is a plantar flexion inversion injury. So for someone where we're working through a calf raise, initially, if we're trying to have less strain loads placed on the ATFL, initially you may perform the calf raise in an abducted position because you'll get slightly less strain loads through the ATFL with the feet turned outwards. Then, as we've built up some level of tolerance to the ATFL and that strain load, we may move the foot neutral. And then if we want to really increase some of the strain loads via the foot positioning, we'll move them into an adducted position. So that's one example of how you can use foot positioning for an ATFL sprain. And we do know that as essentially with ligament, well, most injuries, you want to load as soon as you can with respect to tissue healing time frame. So essentially it's applying the minimal effective dose. So essentially we want to load as much as we can, as soon as we can, without causing further injury. Now, it's really important to load tissue as soon as we can because when we're going through the different stages of healing, we've got the inflammatory phase and then we head into the proliferative and granulation phase and then we head into, say, tissue contraction phases, which happens after a few weeks. Now, if we're waiting until we're in the subacute stage of an injury, you've already had quite a lot of tissue remodeling and laydown happen. And then if the body hasn't been given any mechanical stimulus to know how it should be organizing the tissue, it makes it really, really difficult in the long term to get a really good remodeling response. So in relation to ligament injuries, we know that loading the ligament, and this is grade 1 and 2 injuries, it's a bit of a different story when you've had a complete rupture, but say grade 1 and 2 injuries, we need mechanical loading as soon as possible, again, respecting tissue healing timeframes, to restore the 4-zone gradient that exists within the ligament tissue so it can function as a ligament again. So again, that's one way that we can manipulate foot positioning to do that in a safer and controlled environment. And then again, you'll move from, say, foot positioning into altering the dosages as far as tempo. Now, that's one example. Another example where we may use foot positioning is, say, in tib-post tendon dysfunction or just general tibialis posterior tendinopathy or tendinitis, whatever tendon pathology. So there are some foot types that everyone's foot posture is different, but depending on someone's foot posture and their foot mechanical profile, we can have increased compressive loads of the tibialis posterior as it courses down along the medial malleolus. So for some people, the compressive loads that happen when they're actually loading the foot that's exerted on the tibialis posterior can cause quite a significant amount of pain. So for an individual that's got a pathology of the tibialis posterior muscle, we may be looking to gradually improve the compression tolerance of this tendon in addition to strain tolerance whilst doing certain movements. So this is another way that we may be able to manipulate foot positioning in order to do this. So if someone's performing the calf raise exercise in an adducted position, there'll typically be less compressive loads. And then if we move out into an abducted, we'll see potentially an increase in compressive loads. So again, there's a lot of pathologies in which we can manipulate foot positioning to slightly tweak the targeted response that we're after. But these are 3 examples of how you can do that. And again, we've got entire courses that exist in relation to tissue responses to load, but hopefully this has given you a little bit of an insight in how we can manipulate the calf raise to get more targeted responses and get us thinking a little bit more critically and clinically about our exercise prescriptions. Now, I know for a lot of you, writing exercise programs and sort of figuring out where to start can be a little bit of an overwhelming process, which is why I've developed the Movement Prescription Blueprint. So whilst it doesn't spoon feed you everything that you need to know in relation to prescribing an exercise program, it's a really good framework to help guide you through the prescription process, helping you identify your client's goals, you identifying your therapeutic goals, identifying if there's any barriers that are present, and just some of the key elements that we need when we're prescribing effective exercise programs. So if you're interested in this free resource, head to progressivepodiatryproject.com/blueprint and you can download it there. That's Talisha from P3. That's me for today, and I'll catch you next week. Cheers.